The war was a map, a vast, terrible cartography of arrows and front lines, of shaded zones representing empires and armies, of dots for cities now famous only for their ruin. It was a story told in broad strokes of strategy and catastrophe, of landings and retreats, of generals in command tents and statesmen in distant capitals. The history books would chronicle the movements of divisions and fleets, the tonnage of bombs dropped, the geopolitical shifts that redrew the world. This was the loud war, the war of headlines and history. But beneath that grand narrative, measured not in miles but in inches, fueled not by ideology but by calories, there existed another war entirely. This was the quiet war. Its battlefield was the empty stomach. Its most critical logistics were not for tanks but for tins. Its daily victory was not gained through valor, but through the simple, grinding act of finding, preparing, and consuming food. For the millions of young men transplanted from Kansas farmhouses, Liverpool row houses, and Bavarian villages onto foreign soil, the monumental abstractions of the conflict often dissolved into a series of immediate, physical realities. The chill that seeped into bones from a rain-sodden trench, the leaden weight of exhaustion after a night march, the pervasive grit of dust or the sucking grasp of mud, and always the hollow, insistent ache of hunger. However grand the cause, a soldier cannot charge a machine gun nest on patriotism alone. He requires carbohydrates and protein. However fierce the loyalty to comrades, it is often cemented not in the foxhole under fire, but over a shared can of lukewarm stew in a moment of precarious calm. The engine of war, for all its mechanized fury, ran on a fuel both mundane and profound: sustenance. This is an account of that fuel. It is a history of the quiet war waged 3 times a day, every day, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen steppes of Russia. It moves away from the map and into the mud. It trades the general's panorama for the infantryman's perspective, seen from the ground, often while sitting on a helmet, a mess kit balanced on his knees. Here, the critical decisions were not about flanking maneuvers but about bartering. A pack of cigarettes for a can of fruit, a de-rationed chocolate bar for a single, precious onion. The most ingenious engineers were not those designing aircraft, but sergeants rigging a stove from a discarded fuel can, or cooks conjuring a semblance of gravy from powdered milk, water, and sheer determination. The story of food in the Second World War is a lens that brings the colossal scale of the conflict into a startling human focus. It reveals the astonishing complexity of the supply chains that stretched across oceans, a silent armada of freighters carrying not just troops and tanks, but millions of tons of flour, canned meat, and dehydrated potatoes. It highlights the quiet heroes of the Quartermaster Corps, men who fought a relentless battle against spoilage, distance, and bureaucracy to ensure that the front line did not starve. It showcases the universal language of hunger and the peculiar dialects of complaint that united Allied and Axis soldiers alike. A shared grumble over hardtack biscuits, a universal longing for fresh bread, a common hatred of a particular tinned meat. This narrative proceeds slowly, factually, seeking not to dramatize but to observe. It lingers on the details, the specific heft of a K-ration box, the sound of a spoon scraping the last bits from a tin, the faint, ghostly aroma of a hometown meal recalled in a letter. It is a testament to the adaptability of the human spirit, seen in the foraging, the trading, the improvised feasts created from meager components. It is also a record of profound deprivation, of men reduced to dreaming of meals they once took for granted, their memories of home crystallized around the taste of a mother's pie or the smell of a local bakery. To understand the Quiet War is to understand the war itself, stripped of its rhetoric and reduced to its most essential biological truth. Armies march on their stomachs, the old adage goes. But they also wait, dig, fear, hope, and remember on them. The following chapters are an invitation to step away from the roar of artillery and the crack of rifles, and to listen instead to the softer, persistent sounds of this other conflict. The hiss of a field kitchen stove, the pop of a can being opened with a P-38, the quiet chewing of a man alone with his thoughts and his rations. This is the ground note of the greatest conflict in human history, the constant, humming bass line of need upon which the symphony of violence was played. This is the story of how the world was fought, one meal at a time. The grand strategy of generals and the courage of riflemen were, in the end, contingent upon a single, prosaic metric: tonnage. Victory was not merely a matter of outmaneuvering or outfighting the enemy, but of outsupplying him. And within that colossal river of material, a flow of tanks, shells, fuel, and boots, ran a vital, steady stream of food. To feed an army was to undertake a feat of industrial planning and mechanical movement of breathtaking scale, a silent operation that began in the heartlands of continents and ended in the hands of a shivering soldier a world away. The journey started far from any battlefield, in the transformed landscapes of the home front. Vast factory farms, operating with martial efficiency, produced mountains of wheat, beef, and vegetables. Canning plants and processing facilities, running 24 hours a day, hummed with the work of converting this abundance into stable, transportable form. Here, the war was fought on conveyor belts, where peas were sealed in tins and flour was packed into sturdy, multi-walled bags. This was the source, the wellspring. But between the Iowa cornfield and the infantrymen in the Ardennes lay an obstacle course of geography and chaos known as the supply chain. Managing this flow was the domain of the quartermaster, an officer whose battlefield was a ledger and whose weapon was foresight. His war was against entropy itself, against spoilage, misdirection, and critical shortfall. His tools were manifests, shipping timetables, and inventory reports. He operated within a hierarchical system of depots, a logistical nervous system designed to receive, sort, and forward the lifeblood of the army. At the rear were the great base depots, often located at major ports like Liverpool or Cherbourg, sprawling complexes of warehouses and rail yards where ships disgorged their oceanic cargo. Here, supplies existed in almost abstract plenty, stacked in neat, towering rows that represented sheer potential. Further forward were the advanced depots, smaller and more vulnerable, positioned along rail lines or major roads. These were way stations, where bulk shipments were broken down into parcels destined for specific divisions. Finally, at the sharp end, were the field depots, often little more than a collection of trucks concealed under camouflage nets or a cleared space in a wood, where supplies were handed off to regimental supply sergeants. At each step, the quartermaster made triage decisions. The priority of supply was an unemotional creed: first ammunition, then fuel, then food. A soldier could fight hungry for a day. He could not fight without bullets or a tank without petrol. Yet this hierarchy meant food was perpetually in competition for space on trucks, cargo planes, and landing craft. The dream of a steady, varied diet often shattered against the hard reality of payload limits and immediate tactical need. The system's answer to this problem was the ration, a precisely calculated unit of sustenance designed for portability and shelf stability. For the American soldier, this universe was categorized into three primary types. The A ration was the holy grail: fresh, refrigerated or frozen food prepared in garrison kitchens or large field kitchens. It represented near normalcy, a hot meal with meat, vegetables, bread, and coffee. To receive a hot A was a rare event, a fleeting touch of the world before, and its promise was a powerful morale talisman. The B ration was the workhorse, comprised of canned and preserved foods that required field kitchens for preparation. It included the massive tins of stew, corned beef, and vegetables that cooks would decant into their giant pots. It was less glamorous than the ration, but it offered the crucial element of hot, communal food. The C ration was the individual combat ration, a robust tin of pre-cooked fare like beef stew or pork and beans, accompanied by crackers, candy, and coffee powder, all packed in a small cardboard box. It was designed to be carried, eaten cold, and sustain a man in motion for a day. Each type represented a different point on the spectrum between morale and mobility, between the ideal of nourishment and the imperative of movement. The tonnage involved was staggering. To sustain one American soldier in a theater of operations for a single day required approximately 6 pounds of supplies, of which over half was food and its packaging. Multiply that by 8 million men, and the numbers became astronomical, requiring fleets of Liberty ships crossing the U-boat-infested Atlantic and endless trains snaking across European rail networks. The planning was a geometric puzzle of nightmarish complexity, forecasting consumption weeks in advance, accounting for losses at sea to storms and torpedoes, and anticipating the sudden surges in demand that accompanied an offensive. It was a war of mathematics waged in quiet offices, its outcomes felt in the growling stomach of a paratrooper holding a perimeter, his fate as tied to a clerk's accurate inventory count as to the skill of his own aim. The quiet war's front line was everywhere, on the high seas, in rail yards on dusty roads, and its objective was deceptively simple: to move millions of meals every day from the piece of the factory to the edge of the foxhole. The supply chain, for all its meticulous planning, was a fragile construct. It stretched across continents and oceans like a slender thread, vulnerable to a universe of violence and accident. The theoretical ration scales printed in quartermaster manuals, so many ounces of meat, so many of bread, so many of coffee per man per day, existed in a pristine world of perfect efficiency. The reality on the ground, or more precisely, on the water and in the mud, was a constant negotiation with loss, delay, and desperate improvisation. The greatest artery, the Atlantic convoy route, was a gauntlet of elemental and human fury. Liberty ships, their holds crammed with pallets of tinned fruit, sacks of flour, and crates of canned meat, wallowed through mountainous gray seas. Winter gales could tear cargo loose, smashing containers and soaking precious contents in salt water. But the more persistent threat moved silently beneath the waves. A single torpedo amidships could send 10,000 meals to the ocean floor in minutes, the ship's manifest becoming a ledger of loss, its cargo now a feast for fish. Each sinking necessitated a frantic recalculation somewhere in a London or Washington office, a subtraction that would eventually manifest as a smaller portion in a mess kit hundreds of miles away. In the Pacific, the distances were even more vast, the climates more hostile. Humidity seeped into everything, rusting tins from the outside while the contents within fermented in the tropical heat. A shipment of chocolate bars could melt into a single, unappetizing mass. Crackers turned to damp pulp. Canned goods, if compromised, could swell and burst with lethal toxicity. Even when supplies reached shore, their journey was only half complete. The chaos of a beachhead, like the infamous Normandy sands after D-Day, created bottlenecks of nightmarish proportions. Precious cargo, unloaded under fire or intermittent shelling, sat exposed on the sand, vulnerable to spoilage from rain or destruction from stray artillery. The Red Ball Express, the famed truck convoy system that raced supplies from the French coast to the advancing front, was a miracle of improvisation, but its drivers fought their own war against breakdowns, mud, and exhaustion. A truck carrying cases of sea rations might slide off a greasy road into a ditch, its cargo written off as a loss. The further forward the supplies traveled, the more tenuous their hold on existence became. It was this persistent gap between plan and reality that gave birth to the practice of local procurement, an official euphemism that covered a spectrum of activities from organized barter to outright foraging. When the official pipeline thinned, armies turned to the land they occupied. For the advancing soldier, a French farmer's chicken coop or an Italian vineyard represented not just the landscape of war, but a potential larder. Higher commands, recognizing the inevitability of this, sometimes formalized the process. Civil affairs officers might arrange purchases from local farmers, paying in script or occupation currency, bringing eggs, fresh vegetables, or even wine into the military supply stream. This was the theory, a controlled, fair exchange that supplemented rations and fostered less hostile relations with the civilian population. The on-the-ground reality was often messier, a blend of opportunity, necessity, and moral ambiguity. A patrol moving through a seemingly abandoned village might discover a cellar full of potatoes or a garden of neglected carrots. The line between liberating and looting could blur in the empty space of a hungry man's conscience. More common was the simple, direct trade. A GI with access to the legendary wealth of the PX might offer a bar of soap, a pack of cigarettes, or a pair of nylon stockings to a Belgian housewife in exchange for a loaf of her dark, crusty bread or a few fresh eggs. These transactions happened in broken language and gestures at garden gates, creating a microeconomy that ran parallel to the official one. For the soldier, the acquired onion or apple was a treasure beyond price, a burst of vivid flavor and texture that cut through the monotony of processed food. This improvisation created stark contrasts. Two men in the same platoon could experience vastly different fare. One might be down to his last, unappetizing can of cold pork and lima beans, while his buddy, having traded his cigarette ration to a cook for a single bruised tomato, enjoyed a relative feast. The theoretical ration scale promised uniformity, but the reality was a patchwork of scarcity and occasional, glorious windfall. Cooks became alchemists, using whatever local ingredients they could scrounge to transform basic B-ration components. A handful of wild greens or a traded onion could turn a vat of bland stew into something approaching a real meal. In Italy, GIS learned to use local tomatoes and garlic. In the Philippines, some supplemented rations with tropical fruits. The quiet war of supply, therefore, was fought on two fronts. The first was the colossal, industrial effort to manufacture and ship millions of tons of standardized sustenance across the globe. The second was the intimate, personal struggle of the individual soldier to bridge the gap between what the system could deliver and what his body and spirit craved. It was a lesson in resilience and resourcefulness. When the official channels failed, as they often did, the human appetite found other ways. The supply line was not just a route on a map. It was a continuum that extended from the factory floor to the farmer's field, from the quartermaster's ledger to the quick, furtive trade made in a shattered village square. Every meal consumed was a testament to this dual struggle, a victory over distance, decay, and deprivation, won sometimes by the might of industry, and sometimes by the simple, ancient human arts of hunting and gathering, practiced with a modern desperation. In the gray, pre-dawn chill of a field in Normandy, or the damp stillness of a forest in the Ardennes, the first sign of life was often not a voice or a movement, but a smell. It drifted, thin and tenuous at first, through the mist hanging over dew-soaked grass and the chemical scent of canvas tents. It was the smell of wood smoke, or more often, the sharper tang of burning gasoline. Then came the sounds. The metallic clatter of a heavy lid, the scrape of a shovel against coal, or the hiss of a pressurized fuel jet. The deep, resonant slosh of liquid in a vast container. This was the field kitchen coming to life, the true, beating heart of any company in repose. While command posts housed the brains of the unit and the front line its nerve endings, this mobile culinary workshop was its stomach, and in many ways its soul. The apparatus itself was a masterpiece of utilitarian design, a compact fortress of sustenance. For the Americans, it was often the M1937 field range, a collection of heavy, rectangular components mounted on two-wheeled trailers that could be hitched to a truck or jeep. Painted in olive drab, it looked like a piece of artillery meant to fire meals instead of shells. Its central features were the large, flat cooking surfaces, griddles for frying hundreds of slices of Spam or pancakes, and the deep, cylindrical boiling pots, each capable of holding gallons of stew, coffee, or water. The stoves beneath were fueled by gasoline or diesel, fed from attached tanks, their burners roaring with a blue, intense flame that could boil a pot of water in minutes, even in a freezing wind. The British had their own versions, as did the Germans, the Gulish cannon or goulash cannon, a single large pot mounted on a two-wheeled cart, pulled by men or horses. Regardless of nationality, the equipment shared a common aesthetic. Heavy, soot-stained, and built to endure a brutal life of constant movement and hard use. The men who operated these machines were a distinct breed. They were often the older soldiers in the unit, men whose knees or backs could no longer bear the relentless marches with a full pack. They were sometimes those recovering from minor wounds, deemed unfit for the line but too valuable to send home. They were volunteers, or more often, they were assigned. Theirs was an unglamorous critical duty. They bore no rifles in combat, but they wielded giant ladles and potato peelers like weapons in their own endless campaign against hunger, monotony, and grime. A good cook was worth his weight in gold, a magician who could transform sacks of dehydrated potatoes and tins of mystery, meat, into something resembling a palatable meal. A bad cook could break a unit's spirit as surely as enemy mortar fire. These men worked in a world of perpetual steam and grease, their uniforms perpetually stained, their hands calloused from handling hot metal and rough handles. They rose hours before the rest of the company, starting their fires in the dark, and worked long after the last man had passed through the chow line, scouring the massive pots with sand and water. The ritual of the meal was a sacred punctuation in the endless, uncertain sentence of a soldier's day. As the sun climbed, or as dusk settled, the word would pass down from squad to squad, through foxholes and observation posts. "Chow's up." It was a call that overrode fatigue and boredom. Men emerged from their holes and tents, their faces drawn, their movements stiff. Each carried his mess kit, the familiar hinged metal pan with its shallow plate and deeper cup, often personalized with initials scratched into the aluminum, or darkened from being held directly over a small fire to heat its contents. They formed a line, a slow-moving queue that was one of the few truly democratic institutions in the army. Privates stood behind sergeants, replacements mingled with veterans. The line was a place of quiet conversation, of rumors exchanged, of complaints about the food voiced before it was even tasted. The air around the kitchen was a dense tapestry of sensory information. The sharp, clean smell of soap and hot water from the immersion heaters used for cleaning kits. The rich, fatty aroma of bacon frying in vast quantities. The earthy smell of boiling potatoes. The bitter, inviting scent of coffee brewing in pots so large they required 2 men to lift. In cold weather, the steam from the cooking vats and from the soldiers' breath mingled into a fog, through which the shapes of men and the glowing stoves moved like figures in a dream. The sounds were a symphony of the mundane. The clang of a ladle against a pot's rim, the tinny rattle of a mess kit being opened, the low murmur of tired voices, the occasional bark of a cook urging the line to keep moving. Each soldier would shuffle forward, holding out his kit. The cook, wielding his ladle with the practiced indifference of an assembly line worker, would deposit a portion of the day's offering, a scoop of greasy stew, a ladleful of boiled beans, a piece of cornbread. It was food designed for volume and calories, not for finesse. The gravy was often gluey, the vegetables overcooked into submission, the meat tough and anonymous. Yet in that moment it was everything. It was hot. It was prepared by someone else. It was a break from the dry, crumbly confinement of a K-ration box. The soldier would then move to the coffee urn, filling his cup with the thick, black, life-giving liquid before finding a place to sit. They ate where they could, on the ground, on overturned crates, on the fenders of trucks, their backs against tree trunks. For 10 or 15 minutes the war receded. The focus narrowed to the simple mechanics of eating, cutting the meat with the spoon, sopping up gravy with a piece of bread, savoring the searing heat of the coffee. It was a brief, fragile respite, a moment of communion. In that shared, silent consumption, the unit was reforged. The anxieties of the front line, the loneliness, the fear, were temporarily held at bay by the primal satisfaction of a filled stomach. The field kitchen, for all its soot and noise, was a temple of normalcy. It was a promise, however faint, that the world still operated on certain rhythms. That morning followed night, that hunger could be answered, that someone somewhere was still keeping the home fires burning, even if those fires now burned under a steel pot in a foreign field. When the meal was done, the men would scrape their kits clean, wash them in the trough of hot, soapy water, and return to their posts. The kitchen crew would begin the long cleanup, readying their mobile fortress for the next march, the next field, the next meal. The heart beat on, fueling the body for whatever the day would bring. The field kitchen's promise of a hot, communal meal was a luxury, an island of relative comfort in a sea of uncertainty. For the infantryman on the move, the paratrooper behind enemy lines, or the gunner in a static position under shell fire, sustenance came in a more personal, portable form. It arrived not in steaming ladlefuls, but in a small, waxed cardboard box, a compact universe of calculated nutrition and engineered preservation. This was the American K-ration, a masterpiece of logistical minimalism designed to be carried in a pocket or pack, to withstand extremes of climate and handling, and to keep a man fighting for a day. To open one was to engage in a slow, ritualistic unpacking of the modern industrial state's answer to an ancient need. The box itself was a study in humble materials pressed into vital service. Measuring roughly 6 by 3 by 2 inches, it was constructed of sturdy cardboard, but its true armor was a thick coating of brown wax. This wax sealed the container against moisture, be it the damp of a Normandy hedgerow or the torrential rains of a Burmese monsoon. The wax had a particular smell, a faintly sweet paraffin odor that would forever after be associated with hunger and field rations for a generation of men. The box was divided into 3 compartments, labeled plainly: breakfast, dinner, supper. Each meal was a self-contained module, a diurnal cycle of sustenance in miniature. The soldier would break the wax seal with his thumb, the cardboard yielding with a soft, tearing sound, and peer inside at the compact assembly of his day's fuel. The centerpiece of each compartment was the main course, housed in a small, oval tin can. These tins, painted olive drab, were miracles of metallurgy and canning science, their seams soldered shut to create an hermetic seal that could last for years. The contents were a limited repertoire of hearty, calorie-dense foods designed to be palatable cold, though a soldier might heat the tin on an engine block or over a small fire if circumstances allowed. 4. Breakfast, there might be ham and eggs, a dense, granular loaf of processed meat and powdered egg that, when spooned out, had a uniform, slightly rubbery texture. The dinner tin could contain a processed cheese product, a block of pale, firm substance that melted only under intense heat. Supper offered the most variety: a can of pork loaf, a hash of meat and potatoes, or the infamous meat and vegetable stew, a brown, gelatinous mass suspending cubes of meat and occasional peas or carrots. The flavors were robust, salty, and one-dimensional, a deliberate over-seasoning to stimulate the appetite of men under stress, and to mask any slight metallic tang from the tin. Accompanying the main tin were several ancillary items, each serving a specific purpose. There were the biscuits, 4 rectangular, sand-colored crackers sealed in a cellophane wrapper. These were not the flaky, buttery biscuits of home, but hardtack's 20th century descendant, dry, incredibly durable and bland. They were designed for longevity and calories, not pleasure, and eating them required careful chewing to avoid crumbling. They served as edible utensils, a platform upon which to spread cheese or meat, or simply as a dry, absorbent counterpoint to the moist main course. A small packet of salt, a precious commodity for men sweating through wool uniforms, was included, along with a few sheets of toilet paper, a pragmatic acknowledgement of the complete cycle of consumption. Then came the small luxuries, the psychological balms embedded in the functional package. There was the confection. This could be the famous D-ration chocolate bar, a formulation so hard and bitter it was rumored to contain anti-melting agents and was often traded rather than eaten. Or it could be a roll of Charms hard candy, tart, fruit-flavored discs that provided a fleeting burst of sweetness and could be sucked on for hours during a long march. There was the powdered beverage, a small envelope of instant coffee, lemon powder, or a fruit-flavored drink like orange beverage powder. Mixed with water from a canteen, it produced a lukewarm, faintly flavored liquid that was more about ritual and hydration than taste. No K-ration was complete without the cigarettes. A pack of 4 popular brands, Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield, or Philip Morris, was included in every box, a standard issue of calm and comfort. For the non-smoker, they became instant currency, the gold standard of the informal barter economy. Alongside them was a packet of chewing gum, a stick or two of Wrigley's, to freshen the mouth and provide a minor distraction. Finally, there was the accessory pack, a few wooden matches, a flat, rectangular piece of water-resistant paper that could serve as a memo pad or tinder, and sometimes a piece of candy-coated chewing gum. Every item had a rationale, a role in sustaining not just the body, but the fragile machinery of morale. The design philosophy behind this assemblage was one of ruthless efficiency. The K-ration was compact, fitting easily into a musette bag or tunic pocket. It was calorie-dense, packing nearly 3,000 calories across its 3 meals, enough energy for a man in strenuous activity. Most importantly, it was shelf-stable. The combination of waxed cardboard, tin plating, and dehydrated or canned contents meant it could sit for months in a warehouse in New Guinea or on a ship in the Arctic and remain edible, if not delectable. It represented the triumph of logistics over gastronomy, the subordination of flavor to function. It was food as engineering, a fuel pellet for the human component of the war machine. To eat a K-ration was to participate in a grand, impersonal system of supply, to consume a product that had been designed in a laboratory, tested for durability, and produced by the millions on anonymous assembly lines. Yet in the hands of a tired soldier, opening the waxed box with his trench knife, the impersonal became intensely personal. This small, waxy fortress was his, a private stockpile against the emptiness of the field, a tiny, tangible promise from the distant home front that he would not be forgotten, that he would be fed. The quiet war's most intimate battle was often fought right there, over the contents of that small, brown box. The American K-ration, for all its calculated utility, was but one dialect in a global language of packaged sustenance. Across the battlefields, each nation had engineered its own answer to the same fundamental problem, their rations reflecting cultural tastes, industrial capabilities, and strategic philosophies. To examine them side by side was to see the war not in ideologies, but in ounces of protein and the packaging of carbohydrates. The British soldier's companion was the compo ration, a box of greater bulk and communal intent. Designed to feed a small section for a day, its brown cardboard crate contained an assortment of tins, packets, and cans that promised a semblance of a cooked meal. Its heart was the ubiquitous bully beef, the British term for corned beef, a finely minced, salty, and gelatinous meat that came in a rectangular tin. It was a staple from the previous war, a taste of imperial continuity. Alongside it were tins of stewed steak, vegetables like carrots or potatoes, and hardtack biscuits even denser than the American version, known derisively as dog biscuits. The true morale cornerstone, however, was the tea. Every compo box included a tin of condensed milk and a generous packet of black tea. The ritual of brewing char was sacrosanct, a moment of civilized pause that could be observed in a North African desert or a German forest. A small Tommy cooker, a folding stove fueled by solidified alcohol, was often used to boil water in a mess tin. The resulting strong, sweet, milky tea was a psychological lifeline, a warm taste of home that cut through the grit and fatigue. For the German soldier, the individual emergency ration was the Eisern portion, the iron ration. True to its name, it was Spartan and durable, designed for extreme conditions. Its core was a hard, dry sausage, Dauerwurst, and a packet of Hartkeck's rock-hard biscuits that required soaking in water or soup to be edible. There was often a small bar of ersatz chocolate, made with cocoa substitutes and fillers, and a packet of synthetic coffee. The packaging was minimal, often just waxed paper and cardboard, emphasizing function over comfort. The German system relied more heavily on field kitchens for hot meals, with the iron ration seen as a last resort reserve. Yet as the war progressed and supply lines disintegrated, this iron ration became a more frequent and resented reality. Its monotony and lack of palatability were legendary, a physical manifestation of the shrinking fortunes of the Reich. In the Pacific, the Japanese soldiers' sustenance was built around a different culinary pillar: rice. The standard field ration included pre-cooked, dried rice balls or cakes, sometimes mixed with barley. These were supplemented with tinned fish, mackerel or salmon, or pickled plums, umeboshi, which provided a sharp, salty flavor and were believed to stave off fatigue. The ration was often packed in a small metal canister or a cloth bag. It was lightweight and culturally familiar, but it suffered terribly in the humid, insect-ridden jungle climate, where rice could mold and fish spoil rapidly. The Japanese logistical system, strained by Allied submarines and vast distances, often failed to deliver even these basics, leading to severe malnutrition and desperate foraging among troops isolated on remote islands. Despite the varied wrappers and contents, a universal chorus of critique arose from the men who consumed them, a shared litany of complaint that transcended nationality. The foremost grievance was monotony. Day after day, the same tinned meat, the same hard biscuit, the same powdered drink. The palate, starved for variety, grew dull and resentful. Flavor, or the profound lack thereof, was the second complaint. Processing and preservation stripped food of its subtlety, leaving behind a blunt profile of salt, grease, and sweeteners. The longing for freshness, for the crisp snap of a raw vegetable, the juicy burst of a piece of fruit, the complex aroma of freshly baked bread, became a physical ache, a hunger that calories alone could not satisfy. This shared desire created a strange camaraderie of deprivation. An American in a Belgian farmhouse and a German in a Ukrainian village might both dream, with identical intensity, of an apple. Yet within this landscape of culinary austerity, small innovations emerged and sometimes crossed lines. The most notable was the American-issued spoon. Unlike the spork or the combination utensil sets of other nations, the American mess kit included a robust, deep-bowled stainless steel spoon. It was perfectly designed for eating from tins and mess kits, superior for scooping stews, and durable. It became such a coveted item that it developed a thriving black market trade and was widely liberated by Allied and Axis soldiers alike. This humble utensil, a simple curve of polished metal, became a universal tool, a quiet testament to the idea that even in the design of eating, some solutions were simply better. It was a minor piece of functional elegance in a war of brute force, a small, shared prize in the quiet war of daily survival. Before the first cracker was unwrapped, before the first tin of stew was pried open, there was a more fundamental need. It was a thirst that could eclipse hunger, a dryness that parched the mouth and thickened the tongue, a craving that turned clear streams into objects of desperate, dangerous allure. In the economy of survival, water was the first commodity, the baseline currency of life. Its procurement, purification, and consumption formed a daily ritual more critical than any meal, a logistical challenge that began at the individual canteen and scaled up to the ponderous movement of tanker trucks across continents. A soldier's personal relationship with water was carried on his hip, in the 1-quart M1910 canteen made of aluminum or later plastic, nestled in its canvas cover. It was a meager reservoir, enough for a few hours of marching in the heat. The water within was never simply water. To make it safe, each man carried small, white tablets of halazone, a chlorine-based purifying agent. The drill was rote. Fill the canteen from a stream or shell hole, drop in a tablet, wait 30 minutes, and drink. The result was a liquid that tasted profoundly of chemical warfare. It had a sharp, medicinal bite, a swimming pool tang that clung to the back of the throat. In winter, the metal canteen would leach a metallic chill into the already unpleasant brew. In summer, the tepid, chlorinated swallow was a lukewarm disappointment to a parched body. Yet this taste became synonymous with safety. To drink water without that chemical signature was to gamble with dysentery, cholera, or typhoid, diseases that could cripple a unit as effectively as machine gun fire. Securing a safe source was therefore a primary tactical concern. In stable positions, the Army engineers established water points. These were often nothing more than a collapsible canvas tank, called a Lister bag, hung from a tripod, fed by a pump from a nearby pond or well. The water was treated in bulk with calcium hypochlorite, then dispensed into a shuffling line of men refilling their canteens. The bag, named for its inventor, was a ubiquitous sight, its dark green or brown canvas stained with mineral deposits, a humble altar where soldiers performed the essential rite of replenishment. The taste from the Lister bag was marginally better than the canteen tablet cocktail, but it still bore the unmistakable chlorine overtone, a reminder that purity came at the cost of flavor. For larger formations, the water point expanded into a more complex operation. Here, the unsung heroes were the water trailers, large, wheeled tanks towed behind trucks, essentially mobile reservoirs. These trailers would shuttle from approved sources, deep wells, treated municipal supplies in captured towns, or engineer-purified rivers, to the frontline units. Their arrival was an event. The sight of the olive-drab tanker rolling into a battalion perimeter promised not just drink, but the possibility of a shave, a cursory wash, or the refilling of a unit's cooking pots. The water trailer driver held a position of quiet power. His cargo was more immediately vital than ammunition. In the desert campaigns of North Africa, these trailers were lifelines, their contents rationed strictly under the burning sun, each gallon accounted for. The danger of uncontaminated sources was a constant lesson, learned through brutal experience. A clear, cool stream running through a French meadow could be laced with runoff from an upstream manure pile or a decaying animal. An inviting village well might have been deliberately poisoned or simply fouled by the corpses of the recent dead. The consequences of ignoring the halazone ritual were swift and debilitating. A gut wrenched by bacterial infection left a man weak, feverish, and utterly combat ineffective, a casualty without glory. Thus, the chlorinated canteen, for all its foulness, became a trusted companion. Its taste was the taste of discipline, of submitting personal desire to the hard-won knowledge of collective survival. Against this backdrop of chemical austerity, the preparation of a hot drink ascended to the level of a sacred morale ritual. It was an alchemical transformation, turning the reviled canteen water into something resembling comfort. The process was meticulous. A soldier would pour his chlorinated water into his mess tin cup. He would then take his small envelope of soluble coffee or cocoa powder from his K-ration, tearing it open with care. The powder was dumped in, and the mixture stirred with a spoon. If he was lucky and near a kitchen, he might have a pinch of real sugar or a dollop of condensed milk to add. Then, he would place the cup on the edge of a running vehicle's engine block, or balance it precariously on stones around a tiny, concealed fire made of twigs and hexamine fuel tablets. He would watch, waiting for the first tiny bubbles to form at the edge, the moment just before a boil. That first sip of hot coffee, even made from chlorinated water and instant powder, was a transcendent moment. The heat scalded away the chemical aftertaste, or at least masked it beneath the robust, bitter flavor of the coffee. The steam warmed the face, a tiny personal sauna in a cold foxhole. The caffeine provided a tangible lift, a sharpening of the senses. For a few minutes, the soldier was not just hydrating, he was practicing a small, defiant act of civilization. In the British lines, the brewing of tea was an even more formalized ceremony, a psychological bulwark. The ritual boiling the water, steeping the leaves, adding the milk and sugar, was a performed memory of home, a stubborn insistence on normalcy. The hot drink was a pause, a punctuation mark in the long sentence of the day. It required attention, a focus on the simple physics of heating water, which momentarily displaced the pressure of waiting for combat. Thus, water existed in two parallel states: as a vital, dangerous fluid that demanded chemical correction and careful distribution, and as the transformative base for the war's smallest luxury. The same molecule that carried the threat of disease, when heated and combined with a few grains of coffee or tea, carried the promise of a momentary respite. The logistics of water were the logistics of life itself, a massive, unglamorous effort to pump, purify, and transport millions of gallons. But its consumption was intimate, personal. Every chlorinated swallow from a canteen was an act of faith in the system. Every scalding sip from a mess cup was a quiet, personal rebellion against the bleakness of the environment, a testament to the human need to not just survive, but to occasionally, however briefly, savor. The official ration was a promise made in tonnage and tins. The field kitchen was an island of temporary order, but between these points lay the true, chaotic reality of consumption, a scattered, improvised geography of eating dictated by the terrain of war itself. Here, meals were not served. They were excavated, balanced, and negotiated. The act of eating shed all ceremony, reducing to its primal geometry. A man, his food, and the few square inches of surface upon which he could momentarily rest both. This geometry was rarely level. It was the slanted curve of a tank hull, still radiating engine heat, where a gunner would perch with his mess kit, the metal warm against his thighs as he spooned cold hash from a can, his back to the cold turret steel. It was the cramped, damp walls of a foxhole, where a rifleman would sit hunched, his knees drawn up to form a table, eating with deliberate slowness to make the meal last, each bite taken between glances over the parapet. It was the splintered top of an ammunition crate in the corner of a shattered French farmhouse, a precarious perch amid plastered dust and the smell of old smoke. It was the muddy bottom of a rain-filled trench, where a soldier stood eating because sitting meant submersion, his boots sinking slowly as he balanced his open can on a narrow ledge cut into the earth wall. The ideal of a table and chair was a memory from another galaxy. The reality was a study in makeshift stabilization, the body contorted to create a stable plane for the ritual of fueling. Within this transient landscape, the mess kit became a deeply personal artifact, a soldier's most intimate piece of equipment. The standard issue was a hinged, oval pan of stamped aluminum, a shallow plate and a deeper cup, with a folding handle. Government issue and identical in the quartermaster's depot, they were quickly individualized by hard use and conscious modification. Men scratched their initials or serial numbers into the metal with knife points. Others darkened the aluminum by holding it directly over a small fire, a crude bluing that reduced glare. The hinged clasp might be wrapped with wire to secure it better. The kit was more than a dish. It was a stove, when placed on a heat source, a wash basin, a digging tool in a pinch, and a constant companion. Its familiar rattle in a pack was a sound of normalcy. Cleaning it was a daily meditation, sand and a handful of grass scouring away the residue of the meal, a small act of order imposed on disorder. The consumption itself was rarely a solitary act, even when eaten alone. It was preceded and followed by the quiet commerce of the squad. The standardized ration was a collection of components, and tastes varied. Thus emerged the trade, a microeconomy conducted in whispers and gestures. The transaction was simple, its language universal. A proffered can of peaches, a nod toward another's D-bar chocolate. "I'll give you my peaches for your chocolate." The peaches, a burst of cloying sweetness, were coveted by some and despised by others who found them too syrupy. The chocolate, rock-hard and bitter, was often more valuable as currency than as food. Cigarettes were the gold standard, but canned goods had their own exchange rates. Fruit cocktail for pound cake, ham and lima beans, almost universally hated for almost anything else. These trades happened in the lulls, men circling each other like chefs in a ruined marketplace, their wares laid out on ponchos. It was a game of preference and psychology, a small exertion of control over an otherwise dictated existence. When conditions allowed, a higher form of culinary collaboration emerged, the creation of a communal meal. This required a pause in movement, a relatively secure location, and the pooled resources of a few men. The classic was corn willy, a simple hash born of necessity. The recipe was elemental: 1 or 2 tins of corned beef, a can of diced potatoes if available, perhaps an onion traded from a farmer or liberated from a garden. The components would be dumped into a single large mess kit or a salvaged pot. A small, discreet fire would be built, often using hexamine fuel tablets from ration packs, their blue, odorless flame perfect for such clandestine cookery. The hash would be fried, stirred with a bayonet or clean stick until hot and slightly crisped at the edges. The resulting meal was greasy, salty, and profoundly satisfying. It was hot, it was shared, and it was made by their own hands. The act of cooking it together, one man tending the fire, another stirring, a third standing watch, was as nourishing as the food itself. It was a fleeting recreation of domesticity, a tiny hearth in the wilderness. In the Pacific jungles, the geometry was even more stark, the surfaces often just a broad leaf laid on the mud or the flat of a helmet. Here, the relentless humidity and insects were part of the meal. A man would eat with one hand, swatting flies with the other, rushing to consume his rice or canned stew before it became a magnet for ants or was contaminated by the ever-present mold spores in the air. In the frozen Ardennes, eating was a race against the cold. A soldier would try to shovel hot food from his mess kit into his mouth before the contents congealed into a lukewarm, greasy mass, his fingers stiff and clumsy around the spoon. In the North African desert, sand was the ubiquitous garnish, a gritty texture that ground between the teeth with every bite of biscuit or spoonful of stew, an inescapable seasoning. Through all this, the ritual persisted. The click of the P-38 can opener, the tiny, foldable tool issued with rations, piercing the tin lid. The slow, careful unwrapping of the waxed paper from the biscuits. The pouring of water into the powdered drink, watching the cloud of orange or lemon swirl and slowly dissolve. These were small, deliberate actions in a world of large, violent chaos. They anchored the soldier in the present moment, in the physical reality of his own body's needs. The geometry of consumption was, ultimately, the geometry of survival. It was about finding a flat space in a tilted world, about transforming impersonal issued components into a personal moment of satiety, about connecting with another man not through shared danger, but through a shared can of fried hash. The food might be cold, the location precarious, the company silent, but for those few minutes, the war was forced to wait outside the small, sacred circle drawn by the reach of a man's arm as he raised his spoon. It was a daily, quiet victory of need over circumstance, a testament to the human ability to carve out a moment of simple humanity from the rock face of conflict. The most potent hunger was not for calories, but for connection. It was a craving that no K-ration could satisfy, a hollow space no field kitchen stew could fill. It lived in the quiet moments after the mess kit was cleaned and stowed, when the rumble in the stomach was replaced by a deeper, more persistent ache in the memory. This was the longing for home, and it traveled not in supply trucks, but on thin sheets of paper and in battered cardboard boxes. Food in this realm ceased to be mere fuel. It became a language of love, a currency of nostalgia, and the most fragile of bridges spanning the vast distance between the war and the world that existed before. The letters arrived first, the V-mail missives with their reduced, photographed script, saving precious cargo space. They were lifelines, but within their censored paragraphs, soldiers often spoke not of fear or strategy, but of meals. They described in meticulous, yearning detail the dinners they missed. A private from Ohio would write of his mother's fried chicken, the crisp golden skin, the way the meat fell from the bone. A sergeant from Brooklyn recalled the specific aroma of his wife's pot roast, the carrots softened in gravy, the potatoes roasted in the pan's drippings. These were not casual recollections. They were incantations. To write about the Sunday roast or the apple pie cooling on the windowsill was to momentarily inhabit the kitchen where it sat, to feel the warmth of that oven, to hear the familiar clatter of plates. The act of describing the food was an attempt to taste it again, to share that sensory memory with the person who had created it. The letters transformed the home front kitchen into a shared psychic space, a sanctuary visited in the mind during the cold monotony of a night watch. Then, weeks or months later, the physical manifestations of those letters would arrive. The care package. These parcels, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, were treasures beyond compare. Their journey was epic, traveling from a front porch in Kansas or a tenement in Chicago, through the labyrinth of the military postal system, across submarine-haunted oceans, and finally into the hands of a muddy, weary man in a forward area. The moment of receipt was ceremonial. A soldier would take the package to his foxhole or tent, carefully cutting the string rather than tearing the paper, savoring the anticipation. Inside, packed with love and desperate hope, were the edible fragments of a lost life. There were the homemade cookies always. Oatmeal raisin, chocolate chip, peanut butter, their shapes often not surviving the voyage intact. What arrived was frequently a box of fragrant crumbs, a delicious, sweet rubble. No matter. The soldier would eat them with his fingers, scooping the crumbs directly from the box, each buttery, sugary particle a direct transmission of care. The taste was overwhelmingly potent, a complex symphony of vanilla, brown sugar, and flour that made the sterile sweetness of a charm's candy taste like chemical paste. There might be a fruitcake, dense and studded with candied fruit, wrapped in cloth soaked in brandy, a durable, ancient form of sustenance that could survive any journey. There were tins of preserved fruit, peaches, pears, cherries, put up by a mother or sister during the previous summer's canning season. These were jewels. To open one was to release the captured sunshine of a peaceful August, the syrup a golden, shimmering liquid that tasted of orchards and safety. These private halls were never kept entirely private. The ethos of the squad demanded sharing. A man would pass around the box of cookie crumbs, each friend taking a careful pinch. A tin of peaches might be opened, and the slices divided with a clean knife, the syrup sopped up with pieces of hardtack. To share was to multiply the gift's power, to spread the emotional sustenance as well as the physical. It was a reaffirmation of the bonds that held the unit together, a demonstration that the care from one world could nourish the community in this other, harsher one. Alongside these personal shipments came the institutionalized comfort of organizations like the USO and the Red Cross. Their offering was simpler, more democratic, and no less powerful: donuts and coffee. In rear areas at rest camps or sometimes miraculously near the front, a Red Cross clubmobile, a converted truck or bus, would appear. Women in neat uniforms, donut dollies, would serve from its windows. The donuts were not fancy, often cakey and fried in bulk, dusted with granulated sugar. The coffee was strong and hot, but the symbolism was immense. This was not army issue. It was a gift, a gesture of thanks and remembrance from the home front collectively. The simple act of receiving a donut from a friendly, civilian woman's hand was a psychological shock. It was a tangible reminder of normality, of gentleness, of a society where such small, sweet luxuries were possible. The coffee and donut became a potent duo, a ritual of respite that momentarily dissolved the military hierarchy. A general and a private, standing in the same line, were just two men receiving a small, sweet piece of kindness. The absence of these touches, however, could deepen loneliness to an abyssal degree. A soldier who received no letters, whose family was unable to send packages, watched as his buddies shared their treasures. He would sit apart, eating his official rations, the gulf between him and the others measured not in feet but in emotional distance. The shared language of memory, the collective sigh over a description of a shared tin of home-canned pears, was one he could not speak. His war was quieter, harder, sustained solely by the impersonal machinery of army supply. The taste of his food was merely functional, a reminder of his isolation. Thus, food became the most sensitive barometer of morale. A unit that had recently received mail and shared a few care packages moved with a lighter, if fleeting, spirit. The shared cookie crumbs created a camaraderie more intimate than shared danger. They were proof that they were remembered as individuals, as sons and brothers, not just as serial numbers in a vast machine. Conversely, during long periods of combat when mail delivery failed, when the rations were reduced to the barest, most monotonous essentials, a profound gloom could settle. The world shrank to the dimensions of the foxhole and the contents of the waxed box. The memory of taste grew faint, and with it, the memory of the self that had enjoyed those tastes. In the end, the care package and the USO donut were more than food. They were lifelines cast across the chasm of war. They were promises that the man in the muddy uniform was still connected to a personal history, that he had not been entirely consumed by his military function. The homemade cookie, even as crumbs, was a sacrament of continuity. It said, "The hands that made this remember you. The world that produced this still exists. You will, one day, taste it again." In the relentless, dehumanizing grind of conflict, these edible tokens of memory were the quiet, essential weapons in the fight for a soldier's soul, a sweet, crumbling defense against the erosion of self. They fed not just the body, but the fragile, flickering flame of identity that every man sheltered within him, a flame that needed, more than anything, the oxygen of remembrance to keep burning. The official supply chain was a river, sometimes flowing strong, often reduced to a trickle. The field kitchen was an oasis, but one that could vanish with the next order to march. Between these pillars of institutional sustenance existed a shadow economy, a bustling, informal network of acquisition, where ingenuity and appetite conspired to fill the gaps. Here, the soldier transformed from a consumer of issued rations into a hunter, a trader, an alchemist. His battlefield expanded to include every abandoned farmstead, every wary civilian's garden gate, every dark corner of the billet where a jar might silently ferment. This was the realm of adaptation and invention, where the quest for a taste beyond the tin became a daily campaign in itself. Trading was the most civilized thread in this web. In the shattered villages of Europe and the occupied towns of the Pacific, a universal language of barter emerged, built on mutual need and the vast disparity between what the army provided and what civilians possessed. The American GI, a walking repository of PX luxuries unimaginable in war-ravaged economies, held immense purchasing power. A single bar of soap, wrapped in its waxy paper and smelling cleanly of tallow, could secure a dozen fresh eggs from a French farmwife. A pair of nylon stockings, sheer and delicate, might be exchanged for a whole wheel of hard cheese or a bottle of rough local wine. Cigarettes were the gold standard, a compact, divisible currency accepted everywhere. At a garden wall, a transaction would unfold in gestures and fractured phrases. The soldier would proffer his goods. The civilian would assess them with a practiced, weary eye before nodding toward the henhouse or producing a loaf of dark, dense bread from a linen cloth. The exchange was quick, often wordless, a moment of pragmatic capitalism amidst the ruins. For the soldier, the acquired item was a treasure, the egg's golden yolk running over his sea-ration crackers, the bread's crust cracking under his teeth, the wine's rough warmth spreading in his chest, a fleeting sensory rebellion against the monotony of his diet. Less civil and morally ambiguous was the practice of liberating. This was the euphemism for taking what was not explicitly offered, an activity that ranged from opportunistic foraging to outright theft, its justification often painted in the broad strokes of military necessity. An advancing patrol, moving through a seemingly deserted hamlet, would find a neglected vegetable garden, its carrots and potatoes still clinging to the cold earth. Were they abandoned? Were they not, in a sense, spoils of a war that had shattered the normal rules of ownership? With a quick glance, men would dig with their entrenching tools, stuffing the muddy roots into their pockets. A chicken coop, its inhabitants scattered but perhaps a few eggs remaining in the straw, was a common target. The act was swift, fueled by hunger, yet it often left a residue of discomfort. The soldier was not a looter by nature. He was a boy from a town where property was respected. But he was also hungry, and the line between survival and transgression grew thin in the empty silence of a foreign farmyard. The taste of the stolen carrot, eaten raw and gritty with soil, was sweet, but it could carry a faint, metallic aftertaste of guilt. The most celebrated invention born of this shadow economy was hooch, the catch-all term for improvised, often violently potent alcohol. In the absence of a legal beer ration, a rare and glorious event, the men took matters into their own hands. The process was one of desperate chemistry. The base could be almost anything fermentable. A can of fruit cocktail and its heavy syrup, saved over days, a handful of raisins from a care package, a mashed-up potato saved from a mess kit. This would be combined with water and a source of sugar, often hard candy or a precious lump of real sugar from a Red Cross parcel. The mixture was placed in a sealed container, a cleaned-out canteen, a glass jar salvaged from rubble, even a rubber prophylactic tied off at the end. It was then hidden away, tucked into a pack or buried near a latrine, to ferment in the warmth of a tent or under the tropical sun. After days or weeks of anxious waiting, the brew would be tested. The smell upon opening was frequently alarming, a pungent, yeasty funk. The taste was worse, a sour, fiery concoction that burned the throat and settled in the stomach like a lit fuse. But its effect was undeniable. A few swallows could blur the edges of fear and cold, foster a fleeting camaraderie in a quiet corner of the camp, and grant a few hours of numb escape. The quality varied wildly, from a barely palatable buzz to a toxic swill that induced blinding headaches or worse. Yet the ritual of its creation and consumption was as important as the alcohol itself. It was an act of defiance against the army's control, a reclamation of a small, private pleasure, a testament to the human urge to transform the meager and the mundane into something that could, for a moment, lift the spirit. The official army was not entirely oblivious to these needs. Recognizing that morale was a tangible asset, there were occasional, formal attempts to provide small comforts. In rear areas, particularly for troops in static positions or on leave, a beer ration might be authorized. It arrived in sturdy, non-returnable bottles, often American lager, and was issued at a rate of 2 or 3 bottles per man. The beer was warm and unremarkable, but it was legal, shared, and represented an institutional acknowledgement that men were not merely fighting machines. Holiday meals were another official concession to the heart. At Thanksgiving or Christmas, tremendous effort would be made to deliver a traditional feast to even forward units. Frozen turkeys, real cranberry sauce, and mincemeat pies would travel the perilous supply routes. Cooks would work for days to prepare them. For a few hours, in a mess tent decorated with makeshift crepe paper or evergreen boughs, the war would recede. The taste of that meal, the savory turkey, the sweet pie, was a powerful anchor to a shared cultural identity, a reminder of the normal rhythms of life that persisted somewhere beyond the gunfire. But these official comforts were sporadic, dependent on the larger logistical picture. The shadow economy of foraging, trading, and brewing was constant, a grassroots system of sustenance that operated in parallel to, and in spite of, the official one. It revealed the soldier not as a passive recipient of supply, but as an active, resourceful agent in his own survival. He was a negotiator at a broken gate, a gardener in a stolen plot, a chemist in a muddy tent. Each traded egg, each liberated chicken, each jar of bubbling raisin wine was a small victory in the quiet war, a declaration that the human appetite for variety, for pleasure, for a taste of something real, could not be entirely regimented or denied. It was a messy, often ambivalent but profoundly human enterprise, the ancient arts of hunting and gathering, adapted to the fractured landscape of total war. The guns fell silent, and the colossal machinery of supply, having sustained millions, began to wind down. The ships turned homeward, their holds now empty of tinned meat and powdered eggs. The field kitchens were crated, their soot-blackened pots scrubbed one last time and packed away. For the soldiers, the war's end was marked not by a final battle, but by a final issued meal, a last taste of the familiar, monotonous sustenance that had fueled their endurance. They boarded troopships and trains, leaving behind the foxholes and shattered cities, carrying with them more than duffel bags and discharge papers. They carried home altered palates, ingrained habits, and the quiet, persistent memory of hunger managed and meals shared under the open sky. The quiet war of sustenance did not end with the armistice. It seeped into the fabric of peace, reshaping kitchens and diets across the world in subtle, profound ways. The returning veteran stepped back into a society of burgeoning abundance, but his relationship with food had been fundamentally changed. The years of eating from tins and waxed boxes had left an indelible mark. Some tastes were now forever associated with specific places and moments. The cloying sweetness of canned peaches with a humid afternoon in New Guinea, the greasy saltiness of Spam with a cold dawn in the Ardennes. For many, these were not pleasant associations, and they avoided such foods for decades. The mere sight of a can of corned beef or a packet of powdered drink stirring a deep, visceral aversion. Yet for others, the opposite occurred. The foods of the ration, for all their monotony, represented survival, camaraderie, and a strange, hard-won comfort. They became edible souvenirs. Thus, products developed for the battlefield found an unexpected and lasting peace in civilian pantries. Spam, the spiced ham product that had fueled Allied armies from the Pacific to Europe, became a cultural icon. In America and Britain, and especially in places where GIs had been stationed, it transitioned from a wartime staple to a post-war convenience. Families, now accustomed to its long shelf life and versatility, fried it for breakfast, sliced it into sandwiches, and diced it into casseroles. In Hawaii and the Philippines, where local populations had encountered it through American troops, it was incorporated into traditional dishes, creating fusion cuisines that persist to this day. Similarly, instant coffee, once a bitter, gritty powder, mixed with chlorinated water in a mess tin, found a ready market. The convenience it offered, a quick, cheap cup of coffee without the fuss of percolators or grounds, resonated with a generation in a hurry, eager to put the past behind them and build the future. The morning ritual of a veteran might now involve a spoonful of Nescafé, a habit formed not in a cozy kitchen but in a muddy hole. This democratization of canned and processed foods accelerated a broader shift in global eating habits. The war had proven the efficacy of industrial food science on a monumental scale. The techniques of dehydration, canning, and preservation, perfected under the urgent demands of feeding armies, were now applied to civilian life. Frozen foods, pioneered for military use, began to appear in home freezers. Packaged cake mixes, Tang drink powder, and ready-made meals all owed a debt to the logistical innovations of the conflict. The supermarket, with its aisles of brightly labeled, shelf-stable goods, was in many ways a direct descendant of the quartermaster's depot. The world was learning to eat like an army, efficiently, predictably, and with an eye toward convenience over seasonality. The global supply chains painstakingly forged to move millions of rations now turned to moving bananas from Central America, beef from Argentina, and wheat from Canada to dining tables across the developed world, creating a new, interconnected culinary reality. The logistical lessons learned in feeding millions did not vanish into history. They became the bedrock of modern food science and humanitarian aid. The precise calculation of nutritional requirements, the development of fortified foods to prevent deficiency diseases, the engineering of packaging to withstand extreme conditions, all were refined in the crucible of war and later applied to peacetime problems. Organizations like UNICEF and the World Food Program would, in later decades, draw directly upon the hard-won knowledge of how to sustain large populations in crisis, using high-energy biscuits and fortified blends that were the direct descendants of the K-ration and the Compo box. The war had created a template for mass nourishment, a double-edged legacy that could support both the booming consumer society and the victims of famine. On a personal level, the legacy was quieter, woven into the domestic rituals of the returning generation. The veteran who had once traded cigarettes for eggs might now tend a vegetable garden with a particular intensity, savoring the taste of a tomato warm from the sun. The man who had brewed hooch in a canteen might take a fastidious pride in his home-brewed beer. The shared, silent meals of the chow line translated into a deep appreciation for family dinners, for the simple, profound act of sitting at a table with loved ones, a luxury once dreamed of in a distant field. Some habits were harder to shed. The instinct to hoard sugar packets from a diner, to finish every scrap on a plate without waste, to view a full pantry as a form of security. These were the psychological scars of the Quiet War, small, persistent echoes of a time when the next meal was never guaranteed. In the end, the story of food in the Second World War is a testament not to the grand strategies or the thunder of artillery, but to the human capacity for endurance in the face of relentless, mundane hardship. It frames the personal act of eating, the click of a P-38 opener, the scrape of a spoon on aluminum, the shared warmth of a mug of coffee, as a profound historical artifact. These were the tiny, repeated actions that underpinned the colossal event. Every can opened, every biscuit traded, every careful sip of purified water was a victory over chaos, a small assertion of life continuing. The armies that marched and fought were, ultimately, collections of individuals who needed to be fed. Their sustenance was a logistical miracle, a cultural portrait, and a daily exercise in hope. The Quiet War reminds us that history is not only made in moments of high drama, but in the accumulated weight of countless ordinary acts, like a soldier somewhere, taking his last bite of a K-ration, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, and turning to face whatever came next, his strength replenished for a little while by the simple, ancient alchemy of a meal.